I hired Renee when my daughter Olive was 6 months old. My maternity leave ended on a Tuesday. I remember the exact morning. I stood in the nursery doorway at 6:47 a.m. watching Olive sleep, memorizing the way her chest rose and fell, the small curl of her fist near her cheek, the particular quiet of a baby who doesn't and oppose to yet know that the world is about to ask something of her. Then I picked up my bag and drove to work and cried the whole way there. I needed someone I could trust completely. I interviewed 11 candidates over 3 weeks. I checked every reference, asked every question I and Oppos read about in the parenting forums, trusted my gut, and finally chose Renee. She had 15 years of experience. Her references used words like dedicated and exceptional and irreplaceable. She was warm and organized, and Olive reached for her on the very first meeting, which I told myself was a good sign. I was exhausted and desperate, and I needed it to be a good sign. The first year was, by every visible measure, a success. Renee sent me photos throughout the day. Olive in the bouncer, Olive discovering her feet, Olive laughing at the ceiling fan in that hysterical full-body way babies laugh. She kept detailed logs of naps and feedings. She followed every routine I set. She asked good questions and took notes and never made me feel guilty for working. I paid her above market rate. I gave her paid holidays and sick days. I bought her birthday gifts and left her Christmas bonuses in a card that said we couldn't and oppos do this without you. I meant every word. I treated her like family because she was helping me raise my child. That was my first mistake. Not the trusting, the not watching closely enough. Things started shifting when Olive began to talk. Her first word was dada. My husband Daniel cried. Actually cried, standing in the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder, tears running straight down into his beard. We called his mother. We took a video. It was the kind of moment you spend the whole pregnancy imagining. Her second word was supposed to be mama. I practiced every night when I came home from work. I would sit with Olive in the rocking chair and point to myself over and over. Mama. I and Oppos, and mama. Can you say mama? She would study my face with that serious, concentrated expression babies get when they and Oppos, reworking something out. She never said it. Her second word was Renee. I told myself it made sense. Renee was with her 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Of course Olive would say her name. I swallowed the sting and moved on. That and Oppos. That's what good mothers do, ISN and Oppos. It. Swallow the things that hurt and keep moving. Then one Saturday morning when Olive was 18 months old, everything changed. I was making breakfast. Olive was in her high chair, pushing a piece of banana around her tray. She looked up at me very suddenly and said, with perfect clarity, the kind of clarity that only happens when a child has been practicing, end quote. Where mama? End quote. I smiled. End quote. I and Oppos. Am right here, baby, end quote. Olive shook her head. She pointed at the front door. End quote. No. Mama. Where mama? End quote. End quote. What do you mean, sweetheart? End quote. End quote. Mama Renee. End quote. She pointed again at the door. End quote. Mama Renee come. End quote. The banana dropped from my hand and hit the floor. I stood there in my kitchen in my pajamas and felt the world rearrange itself around me. I asked Olive, very carefully, what my name was. She looked at me. She said my first name. She said it perfectly, the way you say a word you and Oppos, been taught. The way you say a word that someone has been drilling into you when the person who should be called something else ISN and Oppos, in the room. I put on a show for the rest of breakfast. I smiled and cut fruit and asked about her stuffed rabbit and didn't and Oppos. Let my face do anything that would frighten her. But my hands wooed and Oppos. Stopped shaking, and the coffee I made sat on the counter until it went cold. I called Renee that afternoon. I kept my voice neutral. I said I needed to talk about something important and asked her to come over. She arrived an hour later looking pleasantly puzzled, like someone called in to clear up a small misunderstanding. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands folded. She did not look like someone who had done anything wrong. She had perfected the look of someone who never does anything wrong. I asked her directly. Had she been teaching Olive to call her mama? She didn't and Oppos, deny it. What she did instead was more sophisticated than denial. She explained. She said Olive had started calling her that on her own, and she hadn't and Oppos. Wanted to correct her because correcting a toddler and Oppos' language could damage their sense of attachment. She said children frequently called caregivers mama, especially when they spent significant time with them. She said I shouldn't oppose. Feel threatened by it. That secure mothers understood children had room for multiple attachment figures. I noticed she used the word secure. The way you and oppose, use it to imply the opposite about someone else. I asked why Olive called me by my first name. Renee paused. The first real pause. Then she said she thought it would be less confusing for Olive to have different names for different people. Since Olive already called her mama, it made sense for me to be something else. She said she was just trying to keep things organized. Something went very quiet inside me. The kind of quiet that happens right before something breaks. End quote. Renee, end quote, I said. End quote. Do you understand that I am Olive and Appo's mother? End quote. End quote. Of course, end quote. End quote. Do you understand that mama is my title, not yours? End quote. End quote. You and Appo's overreacting, end quote. End quote. Do you understand that you have stolen something from me that I can never get back? End quote. She rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes at me, sitting at my kitchen table, while I sat across from her with my hands flat on the wood, so she wouldn't oppose. See them shake. She said I was being emotional. She said it was just a word. She said plenty of children had multiple mother figures, and I should be grateful that Olive had someone who loved her so much. I stood up. I walked to the front door and opened it. I told her to leave her key on the counter and never come back. Renee gathered her things slowly, the way someone does when they think you and Appo's going to change your mind, when they and Appo's used to being the kind of person people eventually apologize to. She paused at the door. She said I would never find someone as good as her. She said Olive would forget me even more without her there to bridge the gap. She said some mothers simply weren't and Appo's meant to be the primary attachment figure, and perhaps it would be better for Olive if I accepted that. I closed the door. I locked it. I stood with my back against it for a long time. Then I went into the kitchen and called Daniel. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life as a mother. Olive asked for Mama constantly, and she didn't and Appo's mean me. She stood at the front door and waited. She cried in a way that had no consolation. The specific, desolate crying of a child who doesn't and Appo's understand why someone they love has disappeared. When I tried to hold her, she twisted away and screamed. I took 2 months off work. I didn't and Appo's tell my boss everything, just that there was a family situation and I needed the time. He was understanding in that polite, slightly uncomfortable way that people are understanding when they and Appo's rather not know the details. For 2 months, I was there. Every morning, every nap, every meal, every bath, every story at bedtime, even when she turned away from me, even when she called out for someone else in her sleep. I didn't and Appo's force her to call me mama. I just stayed. I showed up. I was present and patient and consistent in a way that I think only a mother can be, that particular quality of staying that has no agenda except love. I sang to her. I held her even when she resisted. I read her the same 4 books over and over because those were her favorites and I knew every word. Slowly, so slowly I almost didn't and Appo's notice it happening. Things shifted. Olive stopped waiting at the door. She started reaching for me. One night she fell asleep with her hand curled in my hair, and I lay there in the dark not moving, barely breathing, for an hour because I was afraid that if I moved she might let go. The first time she looked up at me unprompted and said mama, I had to go into the bathroom and cry so she wouldn't and Appo's The bond Renee had tried to dismantle was rebuilt. It took time and it left marks on both of us, but it was rebuilt and it was ours. 6 months after I fired Renee, a woman named Deborah called. She said Renee had given her questions before making her final hiring decision. Her baby was 3 months old. She had to go back to work in a month. She sounded tired and hopeful in exactly the same way I had sounded 2 years earlier. I told Deborah this was not a phone conversation. We met the next day at a coffee shop. She came in carrying her baby in a chest carrier, dark circles under her eyes, hair in a ponytail. She looked like every new mother looks, stretched thin and trying not to show it, quietly desperate for things to be okay. I told her everything. From the beginning. The photos and the logs and the Christmas bonuses. The Saturday morning in the kitchen. Mama Renee. The eye roll. All of it. Deborah and Appo's face moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something harder. She said Renee had mentioned leaving her previous family due to some tension with the mother. She said Renee explained that some mothers struggled when their children bonded strongly with the nanny. She said Renee and Apos' honesty about that had actually made her trust her more. I was hearing Renee and Apos' words in a stranger and Apos' mouth. She had gotten here first. She had already written the story, already named me the villain, already made herself the reasonable professional navigating an unreasonable mother. I pulled out my phone. Over the months before I fired Renee, some instinct had made me save certain videos. I didn't and Apos' know exactly why at the time. I do now. I showed Deborah the video of Olive at 18 months, pointing at the door, asking for Mama Renee, then turning to me and saying my first name as though she and Apos' rehearsed it. Deborah watched. When it ended, she handed the phone back and said children got confused about names all the time when they were learning to talk. I showed her 2 more videos. One where Olive cries for Mama Renee at bedtime. One where she calls me by my first name while Renee stands visible in the background, smiling. Deborah said her friend and Apos' child called everyone Mama for 6 months. I put my phone away. I looked at her across the table and said, and quote, "You and Apos, we're going to hire her anyway." End quote. She stood up. She thanked me for my time. She hoped things were better with my daughter now. Then she left, the baby sleeping against her chest, oblivious to all of it. I sat there for a long time. I had failed. Another mother was going to lose something she would never get back, and I could not stop it. That night, I went through the paperwork from when I first hired Renee. Her reference list. 5 names. I recognized Deborah and Apos' at the bottom, added recently, handwriting slightly different from the rest. I looked at the other 4. The first number was disconnected. The second went to voicemail and was never returned. The third belonged to a man named Harvey Sanderson. He answered on the second ring, and when I said Renee and Apos' name, he went very quiet. Harvey asked, in a voice that was careful in the way voices get when someone has been careful about something for a long time, what Renee had done to my family. I told him. When I finished, he let out a breath that sounded like something he and Apos' been holding for years. He told me his wife left him. He told me their son had spent months calling Renee Mama, and they had taken him to specialists, doctors, therapists, developmental consultants, trying to understand why he wouldn't and Apos' bond with his own mother. His wife fell into a depression. She blamed herself. She believed she was fundamentally broken as a mother. Then Renee left for another job. Within 3 weeks, their son started calling his mother Mom again. That was when they understood what had been happening. But by then his wife had already internalized too much of it. The damage to her sense of herself as a mother had compounded into damage to their marriage. She couldn't and Apos' forgive him for not seeing it sooner. He couldn't and Apos' forgive himself. I asked why he was still on Renee and Apos' reference list. He said he and Apos' been giving neutral references for 3 years. He said he just wanted to move on. He said every time he thought about Renee, he felt sick and he and Apos' rather feel nothing, and the only way to feel nothing was to not engage. He paused. Then he said, and quote, "But I should have said something. I and Apos' known that for 3 years," end quote. He gave me a name. Judy Larson. Another mother. Another family. I called Judy the next morning. She answered on the 4th ring. When I said Renee and Apos' name, she started crying. She said she thought she was the only one. She said she spent years in therapy trying to figure out what she had done wrong, what fundamental quality she lacked that had made her own daughter prefer a stranger. She said the therapist kept asking about her relationship with her own mother, whether she felt confident in her parenting, whether she had unresolved attachment issues of her own. She said she started believing it. She started believing she was simply not meant to be a mother. Her daughter was 8 now. She still sometimes called Judy by her first name when she was tired or upset, a reflex that Renee had drilled in deep enough to leave marks. Judy spent thousands on therapy before she understood that the problem had never been her. When she finished talking, I asked if she would be willing to warn Deborah with me. She said no. She said her husband had made her promise to stop talking about Renee. She said it made her depressed and angry, and she and Apos' worked too hard to get clear of it. She said Renee was like a black hole. The more you engaged, the more she swallowed. She said, and quote, "Let it go. Be grateful you only lost a year," end quote. I thanked her and sat in my car for a long time after we hung up. 15 years. Renee had been doing this for 15 years. How many mothers were out there like Judy and Harvey and Apos? S wife. Convinced they were broken, convinced their children didn't and Apos. T loved them, convinced the problem lived inside themselves. How many of them were in therapy right now, answering questions about their own mothers, looking in completely the wrong direction? 2 weeks passed. I checked my phone constantly. Then Deborah called. She was crying. She said she and Apos, D been noticing things. Small things, the kind that are easy to explain away one at a time. Renee redirecting the baby and Apos. S attention when she came home from work, turning slightly so Deborah couldn't and Apos. T see the baby and Apos. S face, using the word mama in ways that seemed to Deborah like too much, too specific, too pointed for a child who was only 3 months old and couldn't and Apos. To even understand language yet. Her husband thought she was being paranoid. He told her she was looking for problems because a stranger on the phone had scared her. But Deborah couldn't and Apos. T stopped feeling that I had told her the truth. We met at a park near her house on a Saturday morning. I brought Olive. I told Deborah to come at the same time Renee would normally bring the baby for their outdoor hour. I spotted Renee from across the playground. She was pushing a stroller near the swings. Deborah and Apos. S baby was inside, bundled in a pink blanket. Renee lifted the baby into a swing and pushed gently and talked to her in that close, soft way she had. The way that felt like warmth until you understood what it was for. Olive was playing on the slide nearby. She went down once, climbed back up, then stopped. I followed her gaze. She was looking at Renee. My whole body went still. I didn't and Apos. T breathe. All that work. 2 months of presence and patience and slowly rebuilding what had been taken. And now Olive was standing at the top of the slide staring at the woman who had stolen my name. And I had no idea what would come next. Olive stared for a long moment. Renee didn't and Apos. T notice. She was focused entirely on Deborah and Apos. S baby, whispering something I couldn't and Apos. T here. Then Olive climbed down from the slide and walked back to me. She tugged on my jacket. End quote. Mama, end quote, she said. End quote. That the lady who used to play with me? End quote. End quote. Yes, baby, end quote. She looked back at Renee once more, shrugged with the profound indifference only a toddler can produce. End quote. Okay, end quote, she said, and went back to the slide. I looked at Deborah. She had seen everything. She fired Renee the next morning. That night, after Olive was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Daniel leaned in the doorway watching me. He asked what I was doing. I told him I was going to write about what happened to us, all of it, and post it in the parenting forums under my real name. He sat down across from me. He said it might get messy. He said Renee might come after us somehow. He said I should think carefully about what I was willing to risk. Being quiet to protect the reputation of someone who had spent 15 years targeting exhausted mothers and the children they loved. I said I was done carrying this alone. It took me 3 days to write it. I revised it a dozen times, trying to be precise without being melodramatic, trying to document rather than accuse. I included the specific tactics, the gradual name replacement, the mama language used in a child and Apos. S presence from the earliest age, the strategic discrediting of mothers before they could tell their own stories. I wrote about Harvey. I wrote about Judy. I wrote about Deborah. I used no last names. I used only the truth. I posted it in 5 parenting forums using my real name. My inbox was full within 24 hours. Mothers who recognized what I described. Mothers who had nearly hired Renee and were grateful for the warning. Mothers who had experienced something similar with different caregivers and hadn't and Apos. T had a word for what it was until now. 3 more women reached out privately, all former Renee families, all carrying years of shame they had believed was their own fault. 1 woman and Apos. S son was 10. He still had attachment difficulties. He had been in therapy since he was 4. She had never connected it to the nanny until she read my post. Deborah messaged me 4 days after I published. She said she and Apos, D caught Renee, on her last day, holding the baby close and whispering mama and Apos. S here over and over with her back to the door. Deborah had watched through a crack for 2 full minutes before walking in. She said she felt stupid for how close she and Apos, D come. I told her she had nothing to feel stupid about. I told her she and Apos, D caught it in weeks instead of years, and that mattered. 2 weeks after I posted, an envelope arrived with a law firm and Apos, return address. My hands shook opening it. It was a letter from Renee and Apos, lawyer. Defamation. My post contained false and damaging statements. I was instructed to remove all content immediately and pay $20,000 in damages, or face formal legal proceedings. I called Daniel at work. I couldn't and Apos to get the words out clearly. He came home early. We sat together and read the letter 3 times. That evening we had dinner with his cousin Margot, who practices family law. She read the letter over a glass of wine and set it down on the table without any particular urgency. She told me truth was a complete defense against defamation. She told me Renee and Apos' lawyer was almost certainly sending this to scare me into silence, and that actually going to court would require Renee to prove my statements were false, which would mean opening every family she and Apos ever worked with to scrutiny. She offered to write a response letter. We paid her nothing. 2 months went by. No lawsuit. No further communication. Then Deborah called to tell me she and Apos heard from another mother in our parenting group that Renee had moved to a different state. Word had spread. No one in our area would hire her anymore. She and Apos gone somewhere new, somewhere people didn't and Apos know her yet, somewhere the reference list still worked. I thought about that for a long time. I still do. I and Apos thought a lot in the years since about what Renee actually wanted. My therapist says it can be 2 things at once. That Renee may have genuinely loved the children she cared for and simultaneously needed to be the most important person in their lives. That love and need aren't and Apos mutually exclusive, and that doesn't and Apos make the damage she caused any less real. She says some people are simply unable to exist in a supporting role, even when that and Apos the role they and Apos been given. Even when claiming the lead means taking something from someone who has no idea they and Apos losing it. I don't and Apos know if Renee lay awake at night understanding what she was doing, or if she slept easily because she and Apos deconstructed a version of events in which she was always the one who loved best. I don't and Apos know if she felt anything when she watched those mothers blame themselves. Some questions Don and Apos have answers that resolve into anything clean. What I know is this. She was counting on our silence. She was counting on our shame. She was counting on the fact that a mother who says my nanny stole my child and Apos' first word for me sounds unhinged, sounds jealous, sounds like exactly the kind of unstable woman Renee had already described to the next family. She had refined the system over 15 years. She knew which vulnerabilities to press and which narratives to seed in advance. What she didn't and Apos count on was that enough of us would eventually talk to each other. Olive is 3 now. She calls me mama without any hesitation, without any lag, without that particular pause that used to mean she was searching for the word someone had replaced. She climbs into bed with us on Saturday mornings and puts her cold feet on my legs and asks for the story about the rabbit, which she has heard approximately 900 times, which she will ask for 900 more. She mentions, occasionally, the lady who used to watch her before her current babysitter. She doesn't and Apos remember the name. She doesn't and Apos ask about her. She knows only that there was someone before, and now there is someone different, and this is simply the way things are. Our babysitter now is a woman named Keiko who has been with us for a year. On her first week, she called me Mrs. Marsh in front of Olive. When I told her she could call me Claire, she smiled and said, and quote, that and Apos fine for us. But around Olive I and Apos LL stick with mama. I think it and Apos important she knows exactly who that is. End quote. I almost cried right there in the kitchen. I learned things from this that I carry with me now the way you carry a scar, not with pain anymore, but with a permanent awareness of the skin. I learned to speak immediately when something feels wrong, even before I have evidence, even before I can explain it clearly. I learned that the mothers who sound the most irrational are often the ones who have been pushed farthest past the threshold of what anyone should have to absorb. I learned that trust, when given freely, needs to be maintained, checked, not assumed, watched without paranoia, but without blindness either. I learned that protecting your child sometimes means accepting that people will think you and Apos overreacting. Let them think it. I also learned that we are stronger when we talk to each other. Every woman who stayed silent, Judy, Harvey and Apos' wife, the others, did so because she believed she was alone, because Renee had made her feel too ashamed to speak. The silence was part of the system. Breaking it was the only thing that mattered. If you are reading this because something feels wrong with your caregiver, and you can and oppose, quite name it, and everyone around you thinks you and oppose, reimagining things. You are probably not imagining things. Trust yourself. You are the mother. That word belongs to you. Yindi.